so last time, this is our second class we're working on this. Our primary focus is the ideas of what happened during the times of the second Bet HaMikdash. Most or all of our sources we're using are primarily, of course, on Torah and from the Gemara, from the Talmud, and from whatever sources that we know that are valid sources according to the Chachamim and according to Torah. There is, of course, we're going to mix in sources of things that didn't take place directly in Eretz Yisrael, but a part of world history. Those, of course, are not going to always come from Jewish sources. Regardless, there is an amazing book that if anybody is interested in, for just very 1, 2, 3 history, this is one of the best books you could find. It covers a huge amount. It's written by a very, very, very Yer Shemaim rabbi, and it's called Chronicles Index of Jewish History. It's an incredibly good book, and it's very good for dates, especially if you're looking to get things in order. So, starting with that, last time we really discussed how Cyrus the Great let the Jewish people go back to the land of Israel and rebuild it. And then after Cyrus died, and we discussed that he died in one way or another, it's not exactly sure how he died, then Achashverosh came. He didn't allow the Jewish people to rebuild the second Bet HaMikdash, but eventually, Baruch Hashem, Darius II came, which was the son of Esther, and he allowed us to rebuild the second Bet HaMikdash. So what year does the second Bet HaMikdash get built in? It gets built in the year 349 BCE. So that would be approximately 2,075 years ago. 2,375 years ago. Quite a long time ago. Now, during this time, the second Bet HaMikdash, again, is built during around the same time as Ezra. Right? So Ezra returns to the land of Israel, and at the same time that Ezra returns to the land of Israel, the second Bet HaMikdash is built. Who is Ezra, though? And that's the person we're going to discuss for a little bit. Ezra was basically the revolutionary leader of the Jewish people as far as the way that we serve Hashem. You see, when it came to serving Hashem prior to the exile of the first Bet HaMikdash, prior to that, the way we served God was through the Bet HaMikdash. And that's why so many laws in the Torah revolve around precisely that thing, which is, what do we do in the Bet HaMikdash? Right, I believe out of the 613 mitzvot, something like half of them are specifically on the Bet HaMikdash or things that are associated with the Bet HaMikdash. So, for example, like the Kuhuna, the Kohen Gadol's clothing, the making of the Aron, and all those different things. But the incredible thing is, we can't do those things. Now, we're going to start this with a question, but then we're going to give the answer quite soon. In a few minutes, we're going to give the answer. The question is,
When you say Ezra, is Ezra a Sofer?
Ezra Sofer, same person we're talking about. Question is, why did Ezra create the tefillah at the time that he did? You see, Ezra makes tefillah, makes the idea of davening 3 times a day to Hashem. He implements that during the times of the second Bet HaMikdash. But in the beginning of it, like smack bang in the beginning of it. The reason we know this is because Ezra doesn't live for that much longer. Ezra lives for another 25 years into the second Bet HaMikdash rebuilding. And Ezra passes away in the year 313 BCE. So again, that's not a lot of time between Ezra, coming back to the land of Israel, which, by the way, Ezra comes right before the rebuilding of the second Bet HaMikdash. He comes in the year 348 BCE. And the second Bet HaMikdash is built in 1 year later, in the year 349, which is the same time that Ezra had a massive amount of cleaning up to do. But again, I just want to preface it with the question, why did Ezra choose this time in history to give us Torah? And why was it Ezra that did it and not somebody else? So let's discuss that. What did Ezra do when he came? Let's paint a picture. Ezra comes to the land of Israel, and you expect there to be a beautiful land of Israel. But the answer is no. Israel was a wasteland. It was very much barren. There was only 50,000 Jews that came back, as we discussed last time. 43,000, but then later on more, little by little. But there's a small population of Jews. Maybe, let's say 100,000 now. Okay, let's say 100,000 is maybe 10% of the Jewish people. It's not enough people to populate the whole land of Israel. All right, to rebuild these cities and all these different things that were missing and destroyed during the earlier time in history, that takes years and decades to actually complete. So Ezra comes back, and number one, there's the physical struggles of the Jewish people in the land of Israel. But the second thing is that spirituality is a major issue. There were 2 major issues that the Jewish people had in the land of Israel. And by the way, these Jewish people, although there were major issues, there's also major praise to be given to them. What were the 2 issues? Number one, they were all married to non-Jewish women. All the Jewish men had wives that were not Jewish. They may have also had wives that were Jewish, but many of them had non-Jewish wives. And of course, their children from those non-Jewish wives would obviously not be Jewish in turn as well. The second issue, and just to clarify, we know that the law is that becoming a Jew only happens through the mother, not through the father. Now, the second major issue is they didn't keep the laws of Shabbat very well. Shabbat was very, very wishy-washy as far as keeping Shabbat and the halachot of Shabbat. And so you had Jewish people who were trying to rebuild the land of Israel, trying to rebuild the second Beit HaMikdash, because this year happens in the year 348, the same year that Ezra comes back. And at the same time, financially, it's very difficult because there's no economy. You have to remember, they're coming to a land that they have to redo all the agriculture, redo all the trade commerce, redo all of the pipelines of economy, and those things take years to do. Like, there's miracles, the fact that, for example, Japan and Germany are the way they are right now. The fact that after World War II, they're now thriving countries that produce a massive amount of stuff is a miracle of the day and age that we live in. But back at the time, if there was a country that was wiped off the face of the earth, and the people were removed from it, it would be so difficult and it would take so many years to just start commerce all over again and rebuilding everything and repopulating everything and, of course, getting a proper economy running. You have to imagine that there must have not been that many fields or that many areas of, fields, orchards, and production of food. And so you probably were incredibly limited on what you could eat, right? Every country, of course, has its different agricultural abilities to plant different foods. Israel has its specific ones for sure, but if Israel's trading with Syria and Egypt and maybe some of the Mediterranean places like Greece or other countries to the east, they'll have access to more or less different foods from those countries. But imagine that your own country now, that you're rebuilding, only has a limited supply of food. So you can imagine that the people there had physically a very limited amount.
So who were the political leaders for the Jewish
people at the time? Yeah? Ezra was the spiritual leader primarily, but we're going to find out that the spiritual leader for the second Beit HaMikdash many times was also the political leader, which normally is not the case, to be clear. Normally in Jewish history, you usually have a political leader and you usually have spiritual leaders. A lot of times anyway. There are times in history where it's the opposite, where it's specifically one person. But in this case, Ezra was one of the main spiritual leaders. The political leader was really actually Nehemiah. Nehemiah came about 10 years earlier. 13 years earlier. He came in the year 335. He was the one that started the original return to the land of Israel with the 43,000 Jews. Right? This is really up to the Nehemiah that did this. And Nehemiah is not really as much, he was a great Torah scholar, but he was not known for that. He was known for really being the leader of the Jewish people and getting them back on their feet financially, physically, and so on. And when Ezra comes 13 years later, he sees it's a mess. Not necessarily just the financial areas, but of course now the actual spiritual, you're going to have a whole nation of people that aren't Jewish. And this is crazy. So Ezra gets up, and I believe the story goes that Ezra stands up in the marketplace and he says to the Jewish people there, he says to them, how is it possible that this is happening? How can you guys allow yourselves to not be keeping the laws of Shabbat, which are one of the staples of the Jewish people, and at the same time be married to a whole bunch of non-Jewish women? Your children aren't going to be Jewish even. And the incredible part of this story, which is insane, is that people listened to Ezra. Everybody did. All the people there listened to Ezra. They divorced their non-Jewish wives. They cried in the streets. And they went and they studied the laws of Shabbat to start keeping them properly. And again, this is a really, really, really amazing thing. I think it's shaking a bit, so we're gonna put over here because I think that thing is just way too shaky. I think the video is just gonna come out a little shaky, so we're gonna leave it here. If it's okay, if it's a little cropped, it's fine. But again, the point is like this: Ezra is there to rebuild the spiritual Jewish people. Now, there's another incredible thing that happens at the time, and this is called the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah. The Anshe Knesset HaGedolah is made up of some of the greatest leaders of the Jewish people. And when I say greatest, I mean greatest for multiple decades. Because, according to many opinions, these people were Daniel, Mordechai, Ezra for sure. We know that Ezra is a part of it. Shimon HaTzadik, we know for sure was a part of it. Those four names I just gave you are some of the most four amazing people you could even imagine in history, a part of the Jewish people, and they all made up the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah according to many opinions. Now, there's real questions if Daniel was still alive or not. Some people say Daniel died earlier on, but according to most opinions, most of those people were a part of it. And they were also realizing a bit of an issue. What was that? Not everybody came back to the land of Israel. The land of Israel was not this big, amazing land. It was sad to say, but it was kind of poor. It didn't have a lot. And even the second Bet HaMikdash, which was made in the year 348, right? 349, I apologize, 349 BCE. Even it was built out of wood, from what I recall. I remember hearing the sources from Barrel Wine, where he says that the second Bet HaMikdash was built incredibly cheap. And it wasn't because they didn't want to build it nicely. They didn't have the money to. Brick and stone take years to actually get up and build. You need craftsmen and artisans and labor. You need so much labor to put up the walls of the Bet HaMikdash. And so at first, from what I understand, it was built out of wood and somewhat stone as well. But it was relatively cheaply built compared to the first Bet HaMikdash. Now, the one that we see on the face of the Aron HaKodesh, that one does get built later on, and it's when they renovate the second Bet HaMikdash, which happens much later on in history. But what happens next is a huge and important, we're going to take a bit of a deviation from the land of Israel and move all the way to Greece. And the reason we move to Greece is because it's incredibly important to know what happened there. So again, we're going to end off with understanding that Ezra rebuilds. Actually, we're gonna cut that from the video later. But Ezra does one other thing. What does Ezra do? Ezra creates tefillah, and he also creates a couple other stuff. He wanted to implement certain halachot, like going to mikveh every day for men. That men would have to go to mikveh every single day, or at least after having relations. Right? That every time they were with their wife, a man would have to go to mikveh afterwards. Right? That's what Ezra wanted to do. The problem is the Jewish people said, not going to happen, buddy. It's way too difficult. We can't all go to mikveh every single day. And you have to remember that for them going to mikveh, number one, they were going in cold water in the river generally. And number two, not everybody had access to it. It was not as easy to do as many Jewish communities are these days. And the Jewish men basically said, it's too difficult for us to keep this halacha. And this is one of the most unique ideas in Torah. If the Chachamim make a halacha that it's too difficult for the Jews to keep, that halacha does not apply. It doesn't get implemented, which is exactly what happened. We don't have that halacha these days. Now, Hasidim and now Baruch Hashem, a lot of the Jewish world, they do try to go to mikvah as much as possible, and they go on Fridays, and many Hasidim go every single day, but it's not a halacha, it's a minhag at this point, really. It's a minhag that many people try to keep, but it's not mandatory in the slightest. The only time that some people say you really need to do it is Erev Yom Kippur or Erev Rosh Hashanah, where it's somewhat mandatory to a certain extent. But Ezra wanted to implement this. The one thing that Ezra did want to implement that does get implemented, not one thing, many things, but the main thing is tefillah. Now, I asked a question earlier, why does tefillah need to be implemented? If they have the second Bet HaMikdash, celebrate the second Bet HaMikdash, give sacrifices, karbanot, do all these amazing things. The reason... It's okay, it's all right, thank you. The reason that the second Bet HaMikdash is not enough to replace, so to speak, to give the Jewish people a connection to God, is because most of the Jewish people aren't even there anymore. At this point in history, the Jews are spread out through all of Ahasuerus' empire, which is now Darius' empire. And Darius' empire is like a bear devouring the world. And the Gemara tells us this. In Masechet Megillah, it says that the Persians were compared to a bear in many ways. But one of the ways it says is they were never satiated with what they had. They always wanted more. They always said, more land, more land, more land. It was always one of those things they wanted. And Jews spread out to all the lands that the Persians took. And this was important to know because most of the Jewish people didn't live in the land of Israel at this point. Most of them were living where? Babylon, Persia. Even Egypt had massive populations of Jews. I mean, at this point it was maybe smaller, but little by little it became bigger and bigger and bigger. At one point, Egypt had a insanely large number of something like 1.2 million Jews living in Egypt, specifically in Alexandria and Cairo. So the Jews living all over the world made it that, yes, we have a Bet HaMikdash, but we can't connect to God with it because we don't live here. And you're going to say, well, there's Shalosh Regalim. Who could go to Shalosh Regalim? Only healthy, fit men, generally speaking. And people that could afford it, and people that could take the risks. Why? Travel was dangerous, expensive, and took a toll on a person's health. Because it was incredibly, incredibly difficult to travel back then. So you wanted to go from, let's say, even, let's take Baghdad. You want to go from Baghdad, modern day Baghdad, or back then, the city of Babylon. You want to go from the city of Babylon to Eretz Yisrael, to Jerusalem. A journey like that could take a month. right? That journey will cost you a huge amount of financial money, number one. Number two, physically speaking, it's incredibly challenging. And number three, it's just not financially viable for many people. Robbers, the desert, getting lost. The amount of stories of Jews getting lost in the desert there's so many. So that's the idea that not everybody could go to Shalosh Regalim. You had to, and again, think about it. If you were old, if you were a child, if you were a woman that was pregnant, for example, which Baruch Hashem, Jewish women are always pregnant, and all those things made it impossible for them to actually do, for most Jews, to do Shalosh Regalim. Now I want to make it very clear, there were many Jews that sacrificed so much just to do Shalosh Regalim. There were many Jews that did do it, but it wasn't necessarily the majority. And again, it wasn't because they didn't want to, it was because it was almost impossible for many. Because of this, how was a Jew meant to connect to God? And Ezra and the Anshe Knesset Gedolah, which was a group of 120 great rabbis like Daniel and all these people I mentioned before, they're sitting there and saying, what are we going to do? I mean, yeah, we got the second Bet HaMikdash, which is incredible, but think about it. Most Jews can't connect to God in that way. And you have to understand, the second Bet HaMikdash, the main purpose of it was for me to connect to God. And for all the Jewish people to connect to God.
The Shekhinah was there?
Oh, amazing question. I was going to get to that, but we'll discuss it now. Another thing about the second Bet HaMikdash, which I'm not going to say it's problematic, but it was a reality, is that it was not as holy as the first Bet HaMikdash. The first Bet HaMikdash was much holier. And the reason we notice is because it says it in Pirkei Avot. I believe in Perek Hey, in the 5th chapter of Pirkei Avot, it says the 10 miracles that Hashem did in the first Bet HaMikdash. The meat didn't spoil, ants never... termites and bugs were never found in the wood. There was a fire always going to heaven. I believe nobody ever got bit by a scorpion in the city of Yerushalayim. Nobody ever got bit by scorpions. There's 10 separate miracles that throughout the whole span of the first Bet HaMikdash, they were completely happening. And that was amazing. It was incredible. You had these 10 amazing miracles that took place during the first Bet HaMikdash. Second Bet HaMikdash had 0. Now I'm gonna take that with a caveat. There were some. Shimon HaTzadik had 5 miracles happen with him. I don't remember all of them offhand, but I'll mention one of them. On Friday night, it never rained on Friday night because that was a time that people were going home from shul, and it was not a good time for it to rain. And so I believe, or Friday day maybe. I'm sorry, maybe Friday day. Friday day and Friday afternoon, it didn't rain during his lifetime. But after he passes away, after Shimon HaTzadik passes away, then what takes place is, unfortunately, there's no more miracles in the second Bet HaMikdash. So number one, we know through miracles. The second way we know that the second Bet HaMikdash was not as holy is there was no Aron HaKodesh. If you were the Kohen Gadol, you entered into an empty room on Yom Kippur. You were not entering into a room with anything inside. It was a room devoid of any physical objects. Now, I'm going to say something that is contradicting that entirely. Although there were no physical objects there was no Aron, no Luchot, no staff of Aron HaKohen that was in the first Bet HaMikdash, which were all things that were in the Kodesh HaKodashim, it was still incredibly holy. And the reason we know that is because of a very cool statistic that the Gemara tells us. Do you know how many Kohen Gadols there existed in the first Bet HaMikdash? That from the beginning of the first Bet HaMikdash, from Solomon's time, all the way till the end, till the destruction, there were 18 Kohen Gadols, right? That means on average, each Kohen Gadol had a pretty long span of time. The second Bet HaMikdash had over 300.
People died, right?
Exactly. And the Mishnah tells us that what would they do, or the Gemara tells us, they would tie a chain around the Kohen Gadol in the second Bet HaMikdash, not in the first one, because there were so many people that were not fit to be Kohen Gadol, but they bribed their way in, they paid the governor to get in, they used to pay the Romans or the Greeks to get in, and they used to give the Kohen Gadol's position to whoever was the highest bidder. And these people were not holy enough to enter into the Kodesh HaKodashim, but they would do it anyway. This is almost a complete oxymoron. It's hard to imagine, but there were people that were, let's just say for the best terms we could use, not the best people out there. They were bribing the government to basically do the wrong thing according to Torah. What were they doing? Bribing the government to become Kohen Gadol to go into the Kodesh HaKodashim. And they were not fit for it at all, a lot of them.
But what avodah would they do in there?
They would do the avodah of Yom Kippur, where they would take the spices, they would take the ketoret. On Yom Kippur, the Kohen Gadol enters in and then out and then in one more time to bring in the ketoret, and they would put it down on the floor. That's where they would put it. They put it down on the floor. But the crazy thing is, so many of them would die. There were so many of them that would enter it in, and on Yom Kippur they would die. And the reason for this was because they were not holy enough to enter in. And because of this, you had basically an amazing fact that we know that the Kodesh HaKodeshim was still incredibly holy. The Bet HaMikdash was still holy. It was just not as holy as the first Bet HaMikdash. And it didn't have the miracles of the first Bet HaMikdash. But as far as Kedusha was concerned, it was still incredibly, incredibly holy. And you didn't want to mess with that. Now, again, that's another thing. And the third thing that we mentioned already is that physically speaking, it didn't really look the same because it had a different form. According to most opinions, the first Bet HaMikdash was not built the same exact way as the second. Right? The first and second looked different. You can look at I believe Rashi and other people speak about it. I've seen diagrams in many books of it. But we also know that it was not built as nice, like we said before. So you have this interesting oxymoron where it's still a holy place, it's just not as holy as before. That's really the idea.
From the end of the first Beit HaMikdash to the beginning of the
Second
Beit HaMikdash, what was the duration? 70 years?
70 years, yeah. 70 years. That's what
So they still had an understanding of how it was built. Like
they did. Yeah, they did. That's the amazing thing. The only issue is they didn't have the finances. Exactly. The money was not there. The money just wasn't there. So why does Ezra, coming back to our original question, why does Ezra create tefillah? Because people needed a way to connect to God. The real main purpose of tefillah is a connection to Hashem. There was an idea of davening to Hashem every single day. It existed. It was just not standardized. There was no official way you did it. There's no I daven this part and then this part and this part. It's no, go daven to God in your own language. And everybody spoke Hebrew. But now everybody spoke Babylonian. Most of the Jews spoke Babylonian, which was a mix of Hebrew and Babylonian, honestly, right? And then, later on in history, we'll see the same thing happen with Yiddish, and the same thing happen with Ladino, where these are not really it's not really Hebrew. It's many Hebrew words mixed in with many Babylonian words, and you get a new language, so to speak. And for this reason, he says we need to make a standardized tefillah. Now, there's a real question to ask: why can't I just daven in my own language? So obviously, the answer is you can. There's nothing wrong with you davening in English or in Ladino or in Spanish or in Russian or in any language. There's no issur against that. You're allowed to pray to God in any language you want. But there's a difference. Lashon HaKodesh was the language that God used to create the world. Right? He used those specific letters and words to create the world. And they're incredibly holy. They're incredibly holy and they're incredibly special. And those words have the power not just to create the world, but to change it. To literally change the physical matter in the world. That's why we say in Shemona Esrei, Mashiva Ruach HaMorad HaGeshem. Why do we change in the middle of the year our asking for weather? Because we know that through our tefillah we will change the physical world. So the language of Lashon HaKodesh is very important. And that's why it's so important to daven, if you can, and if you know how to, in Lashon HaKodesh itself. And Ezra realizes you need to have a standardized tefillah. That people will be davening together in a minyan and davening with Shemona Esrei, and 3 times a day that people have a connection to Hashem every single day. And again, a lot of us forget that tefillah is not just a time to come to shul. Sometimes people say we go to shul, but we're going to go over there for other reasons. But the real, if you wanted to boil tefillah down to a very minute idea, your connection to God. That's really what it is. Right? Now you're going to say, well, no, I'm asking God for stuff. I'm thanking God for stuff. I'm praising God for who He is and what He is. I'm asking God for forgiveness, for mercy, and I'm, doing a couple other things in tefillah. But really, you can break it down to those 4 things. Like brachot, for example, is primarily about thanking God. Baruch Shamar, or Pesukei Dezimra, is primarily about praising God. Shema is mostly about connecting to God through His mitzvot. Right? That we say Shema, we say we accept upon ourselves the mitzvah. And Shemona Esrei is primarily about asking for what we need. And then after Shemona Esrei, you have Tachnun, which is specifically asking for forgiveness. So you could break it down to all those things, but if you wanted to say, give me one word, what is tefillah? Connection. That's what it is. It really is that. It's your connection to Hashem. And Ezra realizes we have to have this, and Ezra goes ahead and he creates for us this amazing, amazing system called Shemona Esrei. And at the time, Shemona Esrei is made with 18 brachot. Later in history, it's added a 19th brachot during the times after the second Beit HaMikdash is already destroyed. They added a 19th bracha because of the Christians, right? As much as the Christians are friends to the Jews in many ways these days, many of them are, back then it was not exactly the case. And they're heavily responsible for the fact that the Jewish people were actually kicked out of the land of Israel in the first place. But now what takes place is amazing. We're going to move to Greek history. And again, we're not moving it because we care that much about Greek history, but we care about it because Greek history heavily influences what happens in Jewish history. So we established what took place in approximately the years 349 to or 335 to 349. Ezra comes around, the second hamikdash is made, Nehemiah comes and brings back the Jewish people. All those amazing things happen. And by the way, one more thing. Ezra dies in the year 313, 313 BCE. Ezra passes away. Now, it's not the end of the Anshe Knesset Gedolah, but it's getting towards there. What happens? Actually, the Anshe Knesset Gedolah technically lasts a long time later. But let's go to the Greek history now and discuss what happens there. What's going on in Greece? What's Greece look like at this point in history and time? So first of all, you need to know the geography of Greece from what I understand. First of all, it's got many islands. Greece is not just one body of water sticking out of southern Europe, but it's got many little islands around it. A lot of them. If you want to look it up, get a map, you'll see there's tons. Aside from that, Greece is also a very mountainous range. A lot of it is mountains and hills. Their food that they ate was a lot of grapes. They made a lot of grapes, vineyards, and olives and olive oil. And you see that still in their food today, if you're eating Greek food. But here's the interesting part about what happened in Greece. Greece was never a country. You would never not come to Greece and say, I'm coming to the country of Greece. It wasn't really a country. It was city-states. And that word is very important because without that word, you're not going to understand what really happens. You see, Greece, I'm going to name 3 of them, but there's many more. Greece has a whole bunch of big cities. And these cities are big. When I say big, I mean they're really large cities, some of them. And these cities each have their own neighboring vicinity of towns and villages and fields and region, I guess you could say, almost like a state. But these cities are all very different from each other. So I'm going to name 3 of them: Thebes, Athens, Sparta. The reason I'm mentioning them is they are some of the biggest ones out there, also some of the most important ones as far as influence in history. Greece, let's take Athens first of all. Athens was known for the mathematics, for the astrology, for the shipbuilding. They were known to be some of the greatest sailors at the time, or some very great sailors anyway. They were also known for revolutionary combat. They had some interesting ideas in combat and armor and weaponry. And even to this very day, they had some very, very useful weapons. But on top of all this, they were just people that were, generally speaking, a little more, let's just say, inclined to the sciences, right? They created a lot of the sciences. They made a lot of the stuff that we have these days. A lot of the stuff like the Senate was created in Athens. This entire idea of the Senate and the entire idea of having a group or body of people was made by the Athenians. And again, the Athenians are unique in this sense because they do set up a lot of what Western culture is built off later on in history. A lot of Western culture is based off Athenian or Greek theology and also Greek I would say philosophy. We know that people like Plato, Aristotle, and then there was a whole bunch of other ones that I can't remember offhand. They all come out of Athens, a lot of them. Most of them come out of Athens. And the reason that this is important is because their philosophies are unique. They're actually very logic-based philosophies, but contrary to the belief that many people say, they still believed in a God. Maybe not the God of the Jewish people necessarily, but they did believe in a God or maybe multiple gods. Now that's the other thing I want to discuss. Greek gods. Generally, we're not going to be talking about Avodah Zarah on this class, but it is important to understand to a certain extent. So famously known Greek gods are people like Zeus, Poseidon. Zeus would be the god of thunder and lightning. Poseidon would be the god of the ocean. Hermes, I believe, was the god of speed or something like that. Hera and a whole bunch of other gods. They had a whole pantheon of gods. And even to this very day, the amount of movies that are made about them is insane. TV shows and movies about these gods are made constant. Which is crazy to imagine that there's an Avodah Zarah in 2025 that still has such a heavy influence, at least on culture. Maybe not on religion, but on culture, it incredibly has a very high influence. You can't. I can't imagine you could ask any kid if they don't know about it. Most kids will even know about it. But here's the interesting thing: if you actually look at the stories of their gods and you look at the stories of the actions of their gods, they're awful. They're depraved animals. Zeus slept with every woman he can, even though he was married to one specific one. He went and tried to sleep with every woman, and every woman that he tried to sleep with, his wife tried to kill or poison or do something else to them because she was jealous of them, that her husband went to do that. And Zeus would even sleep with human women. It gets into all the depravity of Zeus, for example. And just so you know, Zeus is like the father of all the Greek pantheon of gods. So if the father of all these gods, according to the Greek understanding, is this depraved lunatic, you can't imagine that any of the kids come out good. And we know they don't come out good because they're all animals also. They're all killing each other and cheating on each other and doing a whole bunch of nasty stuff. They're not good people, in short. Okay, fine. Why do we care about this? Because if their gods and their religion doesn't have good morals, if your religion has awful morals, if the gods you look up to are the most depraved, animalistic people on the planet, that doesn't set a high bar for you to be a good person. And that's the thing. Greeks weren't good people, right? A lot of people say, well, they're the fathers of Western theology and philosophy. Yeah, but that didn't make them good. They were not necessarily good people. They were smart people, and they were intelligent people, but they also had a whole pantheon of gods that were completely insane.
Just like Sodom.
Exactly. Sodom wasn't dumb. They were just bad and evil. And sadistic also, incredibly sadistic. What they did to people was awful. But that was somewhat what Greeks were. Now, I'm not saying every Greek was a bad person, but Greeks in general, this is very much what they were. And on top of that, there's another interesting thing. Greeks hated everyone. And I mean everyone.
They hated each other.
Including each other. They hated their guts. They hated everybody and they fought with each other day and night. They hated, the only people they hated more, as I said in last class, is they hated everybody else even more. The Persians, they would refer to them as barbarians and animals. I believe they coined the term barbarian, referring to the Persians, when in reality the Persians were incredibly cultured and organized. The Persians were this behemoth of an empire. They were huge and they were organized and they were intelligent. They weren't dumb people. But the Greeks still hated their guts and referred to them as lowlives, in short. Not only that, but even other Greeks, people in the north, which would be called the Macedonians, which were essentially more or less Greeks. They're not that much different than Greeks. They were just maybe not as cultured, so to speak. They referred to them as lower class people or second class people. So Athens is a unique place. They're smart, they're intelligent, they're not necessarily good people, but they do set up a couple of unique ideas. And the one interesting thing is, because they're smart, they're very attractive as well. Incredibly attractive. What I mean by that is not physically speaking, although even physically speaking, I do refer to that. Why? The gymnasium is made from the Greek people. The whole word gym comes from the word gymnasium. And what does the word gymnasium come from? It comes from the word naked. It goes to be naked. That's the literal meaning in original Greek, is to be naked is the word gymnasium. Why? Because Greek sport was always done nakedly. You always did it naked. Nothing, and I don't mean loincloth. I mean nude, completely. That was Greek sports. And Greek sports were very, very important. They were not a small part of society. They were not like it was like the WWE, which a few people watch, or a small thing. No, the whole society watched it. It would be the equivalent to world soccer. Everybody in the world watches soccer, or in America, football. Or American football anyway. It would be the equivalent of that. Everybody was a part of it. It was very, very, very enticing. People would watch it. There were shows and Olympics and all these different things. And by the way, Olympics, just so you know, comes the word, the whole purpose of Olympics were for the Olympian gods, right? It was to give honor to their gods. But here's the idea. It was an attractive thing. It was entertaining. It was fascinating and it was cool. Another thing that the Greeks start doing is they start to make theater. The idea of plays and stories and legends and all these different things. The Greeks really developed this into a very, 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 very big thing. The one main reason we know this is because we still have archaeological things about it. Plus, it talks about it day and night. There's so many stories. For example, there's a very famous story of the Greeks called the Odyssey, I believe. I believe that's the name of it, which means the journey in English. For anybody, that the word Odyssey means like the long journey. But these things were fantasized and played on. So they add this idea of theater. They add this idea of gymnasium. They add these ideas of philosophy. They had all these ideas in. Plus, they were pretty smart at the end of the day as well. They weren't dumb. But this is a lot Athens. I want to discuss Sparta for a minute. And Sparta is important because Sparta almost coins the term, or I guess the darker side of somewhat Western philosophy that some people could say. Why? Sparta was incredibly different than Athens. They may have had the same armors and weapons, and maybe on the battlefield looked similar to each other. They both had very large shields, big round shields. They both had very long spears generally. They both had similar types of helmets and armor plating, but the people themselves had a completely different society. The Athenians, like I said, were very cultured people. Now that doesn't mean, by the way, the Athenians still believed in slavery and stuff. It wasn't like just because they were cultured, they didn't believe in slavery. They still believed in that. But what the Spartans did were completely different. They basically said, we're going to make something called the idea of serfs, or what we would call them slaves. Most of Sparta was populated by slaves. I believe they say 2/3 or even more. I might be wrong about that, so that number has to be checked, but majority was slaves. And then you had the Greek men. Greek men had one job and one job only, basically. Fight as a warrior and do nothing else. They were a warrior society. They were big into masculinity and war. The interesting thing is, a lot of people look at the Spartans and say, well, they're so cultured because they allowed women to do business and to run the households and to do a lot of things. The reason they allowed the women to do that is because the men were always dead. The men had one job, to fight wars all day, and they were pretty aggressive people at the end of the day. And they fought a lot of wars, and the men died a lot. And so the only people that were left over to run the household, to run the business, to run the property and everything were the women. So it's a bit of a misconception that people say, well, Spartan women had a lot more benefits or a lot more rights. It wasn't about rights. It was about practically who's going to run the business at the end of the day. That was really the idea. So you have this society of warriors that are born as warriors. And by the way, this is an area that is argued in modern history a lot, which is, did Spartans actually brutalize their children in many ways? Why? According to a lot of opinions, Spartan children, if they were born with any small defect, they would chuck them off a cliff and kill them. We don't know that for sure, but there's recordings of it. But some people say it's myth or legend. Whether it is or it isn't, it doesn't really matter, but it is an idea that still shines a light on what they were like. Even if they didn't really do that, it shows you what they thought about people like that. It shows you what they treated them. And on top of this idea of basically chucking out the cripples and not letting them live in the first place, they were also then taking children by the age of, I think, 5 or 6. Children started to live not with their families anymore. They started to live in a barracks with other soldiers. And that was their idea, that they would live in barracks with other soldiers, and they would have a father mentor or a older soldier that would be kind of their guide. But again, their entire bringing up from childhood, from 6, 7 years old, was already warfare, was already practicing fighting and warfare and all these different things. Yeah, lahavdil Hamas. Really lahavdil Hamas. And the strange thing is, by the way, their idea very much seems to be the idea of the philosophy of, to a certain extent, of the strongest win. I believe there's a word for it.
Survival of the fittest.
Thank you. Survival of the fittest. I believe that's somewhat what their idea was, and I believe that they most certainly were some of the first cultures to really introduce that idea. Right? We know the Germans, for example, thousands of years later, they killed off all their cripples during the Holocaust. They didn't just kill Jews, they killed a lot of other people, including cripples, and gypsies and a whole bunch of people. They killed millions, but their idea was, if you're not fit, if you're not physically able to be fit, then time to go. So you have these very unique ideas. Now, again, the Spartan warriors were known, according to many people, to be some incredible warriors. They're somewhat fantasized for sure, but they were known to be pretty good at warfare. And again, if your children are brought up from childhood to be warriors, they're expected to be pretty good at what they do, at least from what they say. Now, all these different societies there is one other thing I wanted to mention, not very appropriate, but regardless, it's important to understand this. They were incredibly man-on-man in relationships, high on that. According to most opinions,
Only Sparta.
Athenians as well, but the reason I'm specifically mentioning with Sparta is Sparta had this idea where you would have a older soldier figure bring up the younger soldier figures. But one of the things that, according to many people, they say they did, is the older figure would have relations with the younger figure, which today we would call that child abuse, or of course child molestation, right? Again, back then you could say culture was different, but it was still wrong and disgusting at the end of the day. And again, all Greeks were. It was a big thing in Greece in general for man-on-man relationships. It was not exactly a secret thing. That was a real thing that happened. I'm almost 90% sure of this, if I recall, but there was an entire brigade of soldiers. There was like an entire army of soldiers. I believe they were mercenaries. They may have not even been loyal to any specific faction, but they were Greek mercenaries that were completely man-on-man relationships. And they were basically, all of them were lovers with each, like they were all one big loving army. It was kind of weird and disgusting, but that's what it was. Regardless, it's an idea to show that also like the idea of marriage and relationships were not necessarily high on the totem pole as far as important things are. And again, this is, I'm trying to paint a picture of what the Greeks were like. So they were incredibly attractive for being great warriors, for being great tacticians, for being very wise and smart in mathematics. And they, by the way, they were fascinatingly smart people. They figured out the world was spherical, which for many people thought it was flat. They figured out all these different things, but at the same time, they had a lot of bad stuff about them. Now, why do I mention this? Because they were still pretty heavily divided. And during their division, Persia attacks them. As we spoke about earlier, Xerxes was a very ambitious person, hungry for conquest and battle. And he came to Persia, to Greece to take it. And I believe I mentioned this in the last class. Greece was not strategically really needed. It didn't produce any unique silks or materials. I mean, you could import oil, I guess, but I don't think it had any great imports that were coming from Greece. Culture, on the other hand, was a big import, very big import, where they were importing culture to the world in mathematics and these things. It also produced a lot of good soldiers, so much so that a lot of the Persian soldiers later on were actually Greek mercenaries. Persia would hire mercenaries from all over the world, including Greece itself. And that's going to become very relevant to the next part of this. But let's quickly run through the next part. I don't know how much time we have, and I don't want to focus too much on it. But I did want to preface all those things because it helps us to paint a picture of the story of Hanukkah later on.
So you said Athens, Sparta, and you said there was another one.
Thebes, Thaib, I think. S. I don't exactly know how to spell it, to be honest with you. But like I said before, it was incredibly important for these people to be united. And the reason for that was when they were not united, they were taken out completely by surprise by the Persians. The Persians basically burnt down the entire Greece, or at least a big part of it. The Persians also has a massive army. There's a story of Thermopylae where 300 Spartans, but really they say it was more like probably 3,000 Spartans or a lot more than that they fought off hundreds of thousands of Persians, thank you. Eventually they lost, they got all killed, and the head of Leonidas was chopped off and basically paraded around. But the idea of them fighting back and preventing them from coming there was a big thing. And eventually they pushed them out. It takes time. It's not overnight. The Persians, I think it takes them 2 to 3 years at least for them to push out the Persians from Greece completely. But they do. Xerxes doesn't stay for that long. He leaves a general there. I don't know what the time is. Sorry. Okay, maybe we're going to wrap it up soon. I'm sorry. But again, this is all very important because we're going to now develop one more character, or 2 more characters in our story, and then we're going to end over there. What happened is Persia attacks, Greece pushes them out. Greece has a massive beef with Persia now, the Persian Empire, which means they have a beef with the rest of the world in general, but specifically Persia, obviously. At this time, because of this war with the Persians, there was actually something called the Peloponnesian League, I believe. And this Peloponnesian League was meant to fight against the Persian Empire and push Persia out, which they eventually successfully did. One of the main places that did this was Athens. Athens was one of these cities that did this, and Athens then demanded basically taxation from Sparta, which geographically Sparta is further away to the west than Athens is. Athens is in the east, Sparta is to the west. And because of this, they demanded taxes and they wanted more money. And Sparta's like, yeah, we're not doing that. We don't want to be under you. We're our own city. And also, the Persians are out of the country anymore. Why are we still paying you taxes? And so they start a 15-year-long war. It's called the Peloponnesian War. And it's a bloody war between basically the entire Greece, but specifically Sparta and Athens. And then there are other cities that join both sides. And they fight and they fight and fight. And eventually, Athens actually loses, not because of Sparta, but I believe because of disease. There was a massive disease that wreaked havoc on the Spartans. And while all this is happening, or by the end of this 15-year-long war, soon after, a very important thing happens. There's a man by the name of Philip, and he comes from Macedon. He's a Macedonian, which is north of Greece, north of all the cities I mentioned, and they were considered lower class or less intelligent. But in reality, they were somewhat more united. And this Philip first conquers the whole Macedonia and basically makes it into a pretty united force. And then he develops a very amazing weapon called the cestuso, or the more commonly known term is called the phalanx. The phalanx is not actually the name of the weapon, it's actually the name of the formation. It would be a formation of 16 by 16 standing soldiers with spears that were 16 feet long, I believe. That was the longest of them recorded. Some of them are a little shorter. They're not exact. Again, these were things that were made out of wood. So sometimes they were made 16, 14, 15 feet. But they were very long. That was almost 3 times the height of many people, right? These were incredibly long spears. But he would make an unstoppable force of a tank, and they would basically walk into the enemy. And this idea was that they would basically just make a huge distance between them and the enemy. If the enemy can't get close to you because your spear is double the length of a man, then you have a pretty easy time killing your enemy. And that was basically the idea. You got this unstoppable force of shields and spears, and you just go into the enemy. Now, there were some issues with it. The first one was it was slow. Second one, you need to be incredibly coordinated, because you could imagine an army of soldiers running around with 16 feet long spears as tall as small buildings or houses, and imagine they're not coordinated. They're going to be hitting into each other. They won't be able to move properly. It didn't have a lot of maneuverability or flexibility as a battle formation. And on top of this, there was also the issue that on certain terrains, it didn't work so well. On hilly terrains, on mountainous terrains, on valley terrains, it can have certain issues. But the point is like this, and we're going to end with this last detail. He conquers the entire Greece. He uses this tactic to divide and conquer, and he takes one city at a time until the entire Greece is under the hands of Philip the Great. And he takes over, or Philip, or King Philip, whatever you want to call him. He was a Macedonian, but he took over the entire Greece. And he takes it over, and he basically, by forces everybody. He says, you better listen to me, because I own you now. And I don't care that you hate each other. I don't care that you think I'm a lower person. I own you, like it or not. Deal with it. And that's really where we're going to end with that now. But that's what he does. He takes over this. And by the way, all this happens during the settling of Ezra. This is all taking place at the same time that Ezra is rebuilding the second hamikdash and implementing all these things. This all happens within the same time, around the year 348 BCE. Okay, with that, we're going to end the class tonight. Chazak Baruch, and all the best.